I show you this picture to then show you this foot. Any questions? All right, there we go. Get that out of the way. He caused me to start that journey to getting my tendon fixed. That's Bear and my brother. I have a twin. Looks very much like me. All right, so this presentation, I went through a bunch of different titles for this, but you might need a meta framework. A, what the heck is a meta framework? B, maybe you need it. And so my goal here is to kind of demystify what these things are. Generally, we've been getting a fair amount of single-page app development over the years, starting with Angular, going to React, some Vue. And then we started seeing these meta frameworks emerge, like Next.js and Remix and things like that, and started seeing them in use. They were all kind of bringing up and coming up with emerging patterns. So my goal for you today is to give you a good survey of what they are, and then at the end, leave you with some resources you can use to dive in deeper and do your own research on what makes sense for you. All right. I'm focusing more on the React meta frameworks, just because that's the thing I spend most of the time on. There's most of them for React right now. But we'll also cover ones for Vue and Svelte, and even Angular has one kind of. So we'll talk about this. And I'm certainly not an expert in every single one of them, but they all have very common patterns. All right, so you might not. We'll see. All right, so first of all, one of the reasons these things exist is because doing everything on the client, it's like a pendulum, right? We did everything on the server. And then we said, you know what? This is really slow, and we want more interactivity, so we added jQuery. And then we started adding more JavaScript-y things that run in the browser, and the browser got faster, and now the browser's its own client, and it can really pull things back. But there's limitations doing everything on the browser, right? So then we swing back a little bit and say, what if we do a little bit of it on the server side? What if we do a little bit of it early on so we don't have to constantly rebuild these things in memory? We can just serve what was already built. That's a lot of what these meta frameworks have, and it's all based on a lot of these page metrics from Google Lighthouse. They're looking at ways of optimizing the performance of an application. So I'm not going to spend too much time. But there are a couple of key metrics to pay attention to. If you've ever installed the Lighthouse plugin to Chrome with developer tools, it'll let you run all the page speed tests against your development sites. So you can run it against localhost and take a look at it. You can slow it down to 3G speeds and really see how badly it can perform. So there's a couple of key metrics. One of them is the very, very first byte being delivered. They call that time to first byte. And that's like a complete latency, what is happening, and people usually give up if that's more than 100 milliseconds or something like that or less. They want to see some sort of interactivity. Then there's another metric that you might hear, like first contentful paint. Give me something on the screen that I can see so I know that the app actually exists. And if you at least get that pretty quickly, okay, there's a site here. I'm not going to navigate away. Then you've got another metric that is constantly being calculated until the page is done, called the largest contentful paint, which is when the biggest set of results comes back, there's a metric that's calculated saying, well, it took me this long to get the actual results you were looking for the biggest amount of content on the page. Another key one is time to interactive. When can I actually use the site? So great, you're loading things up, but I can't click in a field and I can't type because nothing's active yet. If that's really long, it's going to look like the page is hung, and guess what people are going to do? Reload or browse somewhere else. If it's not something they need for their daily use, they'll probably go look at something else. And then there's other metrics like first input delay, which is kind of like between that first paint and when you go interactive. Can I do anything in the meantime? Can I start typing into a field? Can I get something done? Even though I can't operate on that field, can I get it done? So I'm bringing these up not to try to solve them and make you experts in them, but just to realize that these are important things to look at if you're optimizing performance. You have to know where the performance problem lies in order to focus on some sort of solution for that problem. The other one I want to mention also is cumulative layout shift, and I think this is definitely one Drew has dealt with in the past where you've got content that's going to show up on the page. You show like the frame of the page. Maybe you've got some sort of things that can resize. And as you're resizing things as they come in like images, it relays out the page, which slows everything down. So you want to avoid layout shifts. And then there's a calculation in page speed about, well, you spent this much time shifting the layout. You could have done by putting things in the first place at the right size so you don't screw things up and make it slow. So just pointing out these exist. These are important to know about. So as single-page app developers in something like React or Angular or Vue or whatever, we try to do what we can not to hold up the response for the web. Do whatever you can to not, write things that have to boot first that take 30 seconds before you bring your page up. All bad. There's things like, if you're running in serverless or something like that, and you're serving for serverless framework, there's a boot time, cold start time for delivering that first content. It might be a couple hundred milliseconds. That's the time to first byte. Nothing's showing up yet. So you may have to cache that to make that better, right? There's things you can do on the server side. But you try not to hold up the web response. So you're trying to pick something that serves it quickly, maybe use a good content delivery network, what have you, speed up the access. Anything that keeps the first elements from displaying. So again, don't do a promise and then only show the entire view when the promise is complete, right? That's all bad. Show that frame. Show something and get it started. Really long delays in loading. You have a promise-based thing or a bunch of calls that take forever. Maybe you have a series of calls, the way you architected it, where I've got to get the parent to get the children to get these children to get that, and that's a waterfall. I get this, wait, get this, wait, get this, wait. So we try to avoid that where we can by kicking off promises in parallel if we can, depending, right? And this is all like the old client-server days where you've got people who decide that they'd rather load the million rows and then filter them on the client side. That's like where clauses, filtering on the server maybe. So try not to do things like that. So we try not to do things that are crazy. After a while, you'll learn it is only a browser, and you only have the bandwidth that the person has, not that you have sitting in your office with your gigabit connection and everything. And again, poor CSS design. It's just call it Ken's design. You'll be good to go. So all these things that sound relatively straightforward, I'm sure if you've done any single-page apps, you've optimized a fair amount of these things and noticed, probably people complain to you. We had an application I worked on where the app persisted an entire search result into local storage. And what they did was they actually turned into a giant string, stuffed in a local storage. Open the browser again, it reloads that string, populates it back into JSON, and then they immediately run the query. And it's you didn't use it for anything, but it was one of those, little optimizations. You find the piece of code and go, what are you doing? So there's certainly things you can do on the client side to make things better, right? But in the end, it's just a client. So again, sure, a lot of these things make sense. If you do fetching data, you render the target view immediately. You put skeletons up, right? Little blocks that make the same size, so when you resize things later, or when you replace them later, it doesn't resize your content. Try to render things in the viewport if you can. Find image libraries that determine, oh, okay, if I'm below the fold, don't bother loading this image. Okay, so these are all things you could do. And some of these things you can do with the meta framework as well. So it can help you do that and provide them for you, specifically things like the images, stuff like that. But some of this is out of your control because, you're a client. You're not a server. So, meta frameworks. You may consider using a meta framework if you need to wrestle with build and environment deployment issues. You want to have development versus test versus production settings, things like that, a build pipeline, something that deals with static assets, generates content perhaps from a CMS or from Git, from something like that, or a database even. You may want to have some sort of build platform that deals with both your client and your server code in a way where you can share things like types and helper classes and things like that. So you want to have some sort of meta framework that's friendly to that kind of configuration. Okay. So let's look at some meta frameworks. First of all, what is a meta framework? So it could be a platform that makes developing a component library easier and makes it more powerful for you. It could be a way to work with a bunch of different data sources and put them together in one website. It's like generating content. And maybe you have interactive components after that's been loaded that then query later. It could be a really good build system that has a way of extending itself by plugins. And it could be some sort of optimizer. How many of us have dealt with writing things like roll-up scripts and working with custom Webpack builds? Does anyone want to do that anymore? Does anyone really want to do that anymore? It's horrible. So all of these things are features that a lot of these meta frameworks give to you. So the idea is the component library is just a component library. And Create React App got us somewhere, if we look at the React world, or Vite for creating a Vue app or what have you. It gets you somewhere. It gets you like a Webpack dev server, and it gets you, a hot module reloading as you're developing. But like for dealing with building things that are going to be performing in production, it kind of leaves you at the door and says, well, you got to figure that out yourself. Another quote from Ben Holmes is a meta framework is a system one level above that stitches multiple frameworks together. Yeah, that's about right too. So yes, it's all of those things. Depending on the frameworks, almost all those things. So the goal would be, if you're going to use one of these things, it's got to really materially help you. If your app is working fine now, don't bother with the meta framework yet. You may not need it, right? But some of these things can be really helpful, right? So again, don't do it just because it's cool and new. Some of these have huge feature sets. If you look at Next.js, for example, there are a ton of things you can do in Next.js. If you've never done React before, you're going to be looking at way too much all at once. So just keep in mind, take the time. And if you're going to work on one of these frameworks, it really does require you to kind of think about it at a systems level. So you do want to have someone who really is good with UX and UI to think about like what all the different assets are and how they're going to lay out and what you're going to take advantage of, and then look at the framework and see what it can provide for you. Definitely around the CSS, you're going to have to pick a CSS framework to work with, or using Sass, CSS and JS, CSS modules, what makes sense for you and for the component library, and then what is supported by the meta framework. Then someone's got to be good at the component library itself to wrestle with that. And sometimes after a number of implementations, 2 or 3 of these are one person. But at first, you probably want to have some specialization, some people with some background that can help you with this. And of course, if you're dealing with things like TypeScript, it's going to take a little while to get really good at TypeScript just because you wrestle with types a lot. All right, so sometimes these are different people, sometimes they're people who've done it a couple times. The other thing to keep in mind about this is you lock in. So if you decide you're going to use, let's say, Next.js or Gatsby or Remix or Vite, sorry, not Vite, Nuxt or SvelteKit, all these ones I'm going to talk about, you're not just working with the component library anymore. You're working with a bunch of implementations of design patterns, and they're different even within the same component library. We're going to look at 3 of them for React and talk about them, and they all do things just differently enough that you're not going to be able to just flip a switch. The analogy would be in the old Hibernate days in Java. Oh, I want to switch from Oracle to SQL Server. Depending on how we were just talking about this yesterday, depending on how you've architected that database design, you can't just flip a switch, right? So it's the same kind of thing here. You're going to be investing in mechanisms and techniques that make you specifically work in that particular framework. So a lot of it also is, is this framework going to be around in a couple of years, do we think? Is it well-funded? Is it well-supported? Is it backed by someone with money? Does it have good hosting options so I don't have just one place to host it? Things like that. So just keep that in mind. You're as locked in as you are with a CSS framework or component library. But now, again, they're implementations of concepts. The concepts are the same. All right, so we're going to look at a couple of key concepts you're going to use, but every vendor does it slightly differently. There are some emerging trends we'll talk about that might make this a little more common shared code in the future. Also, opt into a feature when you know you really need it, because that means you don't have to opt out of it later. So if you don't have an image pipelining problem, you have 10 images in your whole app and you can compress them once, don't bother with the image pipelining, right? If you're a content management system, you might really care about that stuff. If you're just an application that has a few background images and stuff, you don't have to go all the way down this road for that particular feature. So when it provides you significant value and it simplifies the challenge, then you can opt into it. But you don't have to opt into every piece of the meta framework if you don't need it. All right, so let's look at some of the common techniques we have with these meta frameworks. So the first one, it's probably the oldest one, is static site generation. And if you go all the way back to the aughts, we had Jekyll and Hugo were the first ones that really did this in websites. They basically took code and they ran it through a generator, looked at data sources, and turned it into a website. Static website hosted on anything. And so static site generation, you generally just serve that on some sort of content delivery network and you're done with it for the most part. The challenge with this is going to be, how often do I need to regenerate that site? If this is a marketing website that gets an update every week or two, and it's reasonable size, and you can get the build done in enough time to not take a whole week to generate a week's worth of content, which is generally not going to happen. But then it could be worth it for you, especially if the data is relatively static. Static site generation as a feature is a good thing. If you have a giant amount of potential content to render, there are some variants on static site generation that allow for some baseline of content to be pre-generated, and then allow the runtime that runs the app itself to incrementally, as you're requesting something that's stale or that you haven't hit yet, generate it in a cache, file-based cache, let's say, and that way it gets generated over time, but the things you're always hitting are already there. That's called incremental static generation, or deferred static generation, which is the term Gatsby uses, for example. So this is, again, great for marketing, public websites, blogs, things where it's not like highly transactional, people using it all the time, by request different data, right? Sorry for the small font here. So for server-side rendering, this is the opposite. Your request, you have to log into the site, and you need to get the list of tasks you're working on, let's say, and other pieces of information. And maybe for some reason, you have people that are on their mobile devices, and they may be in slower networks. And so the server itself can get to the data faster than they can by hitting a bunch of fetches. There's a benefit of server-side rendering. So you can have the server do the work, and the server can assemble the chunks of HTML to bring back instead of booting a JS framework, loading it up, doing the fetches, waiting for the promises to complete, and then get it back. In some cases, this is faster for the client than doing everything from a bunch of promises from one desktop computer. But where that can fall down, of course, is when you under-provision the servers that are doing static generation or server-side generation, and now all of a sudden you hit the server and it's thinking because you don't have enough user threads running to handle it. So this requires care and feeding, but it is another technique. So it can slow down initial page rendering if the servers are constrained. The benefit, though, is just like with static site generation, the content is there while the crawlers are active. So when the crawlers are searching your site, if this is publicly available content, and it just varies by some sort of set of URLs based on a list or what have you, you could have it crawl with SEO information coming back for you. So you solve that problem as well. Again, the asset pipelining we talked about. So we'll talk about Gatsby a bit. That is like an asset pipeline system. It takes a lot of content types and makes them available to you. Next.js, for example, we'll see has asset pipelining built into it to handle like processing images and things like that. So there are a number of them that will basically, at build time, do all sorts of nice things for you. Or even at runtime, they can create a font cache, or they can create like an image cache. And as you hit images, they can store them and then fetch them back for you the next time and resize them and things like that. So pretty handy. Inlining fonts, handling CSS configurations for you, so you don't have to figure out how to install and configure post CSS or Tailwind or wherever. There's an easy method or recipe for doing it for that framework. As opposed to completely starting from scratch, I just did create React app. Now I have to do all the steps to integrate this thing, and all the steps to integrate this tool and this tool. They already have kind of prefab solutions for turning them on. Usually it's installing the package, and then like one small piece of configuration, and it's up and running and documented. Lately, the pattern has been mono repos for complex websites. So I would say this is probably about 4 to 5 years we've really seen this take off. So if you're doing a lot of JavaScript development, let's say you're building component libraries and utility classes and maybe even node server, and then you're doing your React or whatever front end. You could have them all on separate GitHub repos, and you could do that. And you could then publish them, onto NPM and share the version of that particular, component library and pick it up from the other side. But in many cases, all of these are in service of one application, right? My application needs a component library. My application needs a design system. My application needs server-side stuff. It needs React. So what a lot of developers do is they create one top-level Git repo. And that Git repo is enabled with some sort of mono repo build tool, whether it's Yarn, Berry, Vite, SWC, Turbo Build, whatever, that lets you build them all together as a unit. It also lets you share those dependencies very easily, too. So there's a pattern usually for saying, OK, here's my design system. It's going to be this package name, and this other package in the mono repo just imports it and says, just take the version we have. Don't publish it to NPM. Just take the current version of that thing, and I use it. So when you do a build, everything's available to everything else where it needs to be. But you're still breaking them down into multiple smaller repos, so to speak, smaller packages that ultimately could be pushed off and shared if you really had them to be shared across teams. You could do that and publish that as its own repo and use NPM to get it. But for the time being, you get the benefits of having an external package, so they're separated and well organized until you need to go to actually making it a published item in your company. Another trend we're seeing emerge, and it's very early, is React server components. Yeah, we're back to the server, right? So this is something that Dan Abramoff and the team at React have really been pushing. Is anyone here, first of all, who's a React developer in this room? Anybody? OK. Has anyone looked at react.dev? It's the new version of the React website. Yeah. So they even recommend use a monorepo, use a meta framework, and they recommend Next.js as one option. And there's a reason. And it's because they've been working on these server-side React components. And basically, it's server-side rendering. So it's like you running your URL, you hit your URL, it goes to the server, it renders the React component on the server side, ships the HTML, and then boots the React app from wherever that is. So React 18 components, by default, are server-generated if you use a meta framework that supports React 18 and server-side components. So many conditionals there, right? But Next.js, and I noticed also Gatsby just released their version of that. I don't know how good it is, but they all use a specific little feature that by default they assume when you turn this on that everything's server rendered. And if you do a little directive at the top of your script, use client, it basically tells the framework, oh, download this as an actual React component and start it on the client side. So you opt into server side by default in the general case and turn on client side components for some part of the tree. So this is something to look for. I think ultimately, right now, there's a bit of an argument between the Remix team and Dan Abramoff about like what they're doing, the way they're doing server components, dealing with things like suspense and suspending your views. And we'll have to see how long it takes for that to shake out. But that's the third one that would, once they start serving React server components, then it seems like it'll be something you could port between the three frameworks to some degree. We'll see. All right. So let's go through the frameworks and just kind of talk through each one of them a bit. So there are 6 of them that I'm looking at today. So in React, we got 3. I already kind of mentioned them as Gatsby and Next and Remix, and there are others, but those are the 3 that are kind of bubbling up right now that we've seen. If you do Svelte, anyone here doing Svelte development? All right, you got 1, 2-ish, yeah. It's newer, well, it's not newer, but it's gotten funding now from Vercel. So the developer of Svelte was hired by Vercel, who also develops Next.js. And they really believe in having like multiple frameworks available to you. So he's funded now. So there are a lot of changes to Svelte coming, and they have been updated in the last 6 months to a year. And they created one of these meta frameworks called SvelteKit on top of it. Vue has one called Nuxt. It was directly inspired by Next.js. So concept-wise, they're like, we got to do the same things Next does. And they implement them differently, of course, because it's Vue and they're doing their own thing. But concept-wise, it's the same concepts. Not to be outdone, Angular, still trying to be relevant, has they're going to kill me on this one, but it has analogs. So this is just starting, it looks like. It's only got a couple hundred commits, but they're building their own meta framework called Analog, or someone is that's working with that team. And so they do the server-side rendering, which you already could do in Angular Universal, but they're working on doing that in a more common way, and I think static site generation, things like that as well. Not going to really look at it much, just going to talk about it for a minute, that's it. And there are a bunch of others out there. So it's the cool new thing, but let's just start diving in. So the first one is Gatsby. So Gatsby started out life as a static site generator. That was its goal. And it used GraphQL, still does, as the API to query the data sources during build time. So whether you're using a headless content management system, or you're using a database, or you're using a bunch of files, and maybe they're markdown files that you're transforming with stuff at the top to say what the title is and things like that. Gatsby is good at that. That's its job in life, is to generate content to serve as statically. That's how it was first created. And they have a whole bunch of plugins. So plugins will enable features like the file-based crawling, like going to a database and load a Postgres plugin and query a table and say, out of all the rows in this table, run this template through these rows, generate the static content, now I have pages. So if you're looking for a site generator, they've been doing this the longest, at least from these frameworks. And they're using the React APIs to create the components to render things. And you can certainly have it create client-side components that when the site comes up, now I have a React front end. Now, of course, because of all these things going on, they're supporting server-side rendering too. So you have to, I think, deploy to Gatsby Cloud, which is their cloud service, in order to get the server-side rendering. So you have to opt into like their hosting services to do that, I believe. But they're starting to support that. But if your main goal is to generate content that's static and have some interactivity in the React side once it's booted, Gatsby is a tool you could look at. The biggest caveat there is you better really like GraphQL, because the pipelines expose everything in querying in GraphQL. So the building tool that builds your pages, generally you'll have GraphQL queries saying, I want, out of all my metadata, give me the pages with these particular parameters, and that's what I'm looking for from this particular tree. I want all the markdown files. So for the markdown files, for this category, I'm going to transform them with this template and put the title here, the description here, the whatever here. That's what Gatsby is good at. That's its claim to fame. But again, you got to really kind of invest in GraphQL. If you're not doing GraphQL anywhere else in your organization, now you got to learn GraphQL. So you better really like it when you learn it, because you'll be using it a lot for CMS. Next.js. So they started with server-side rendering. They took the approach of, okay, we're going to do this, hitting a URL, and we're going to load the page. And when we load the page, we're going to server render it first, ship the content down as HTML, and then boot React on top of it, hydrate the React application on top of it. That was the thing that really kicked them off. A couple versions in, they supported static site generation too, because they just saw what others were doing and said, okay, we can implement that. And so they have their own static site generation. They have the ability to incrementally add to the site, so you can give it directives and say, all right, I want these particular paths to be server generated, but I want these other paths to be dynamically loaded and cached as they're hit. And you can also say, for the static content, I want to revalidate this content every 30 minutes or every 3 days or what have you. So you can even give directives like that. So you can have it generate the code for the page and then update the code dynamically and update their cache. They have asset pipelining too. So for example, they've got the ability to inline fonts, to set up comment headers and things like that, to deal with a whole bunch of different CSS frameworks. They do Sass and CSS.js, so does Gatsby, by the way. There's a bunch of different like CSS options. So if you're looking to use a CSS and JS library, like Emotion, or was it, I always get the name wrong. The latest one is Goober, which Goober's a great name. Um, Goober is a CSS and JavaScript framework similar to, what is it, in design, style components, thank you. I have my person who has all the knowledge in front of me. And yeah, and Vercel sponsors them. So Vercel was basically created, I believe, created around this, or at least they created this framework around Vercel hosting it first. And Guillermo Rauch, who created Next.js, spoke at ETE in 2016 to talk about his new framework called Next.js. So hey, we were there too. I encourage you to go back, you can look at that and see what they were thinking of way back when in the early versions of Next.js. There's a lot of stuff going on with that framework. And one of the biggest things that's come out is Next.js 13. If you go to beta.nextjs.org, there's a new routing system. So I should pull back and explain that almost all of these systems use a router to go from page to page, just like any front-end app does. But that router is based on a directory structure. So you usually have a pages folder, and then a page is a top-level component. And you can hit the URLs for those directories, and it will serve the component. So it's file-based routing. And the reason for that is you want to be able to start wherever you need to get to the app to start it off. And then you see the first view quickly, and behind the scenes, it bootstraps the rest of React, it loads the router on the client side, and then you're off and running. So it has that, and it's had that since the beginning. But or at least early, one of the things they've done is they've reworked their router, and they have now a nice nested template system. They support React server components. They support fallbacks for the routes. They support the suspense tag in React, so you can say, hey, this is still loading, so I'm going to show some placeholder content while it's loading automatically with just a simple React component. Or you can say for the entire route, I can have a loading.js or TS file that gets rendered automatically for the whole route if you want to. It's like, wait, hold on, it's not done. Oh, now it's done. And one of the other things they're starting to do is another emerging trend, which is they're starting to use what Remix does, which is using standard HTTP browser APIs on the server side. So when you're writing your components, you can use fetch, and you can use request, the response, the URL, all those things. You're using the same library for the most part. There's slight additions to it for the server side, of course. But for the most part, you're doing the same. I'm going to go async await my request from fetch, and then I'm going to call await on JSON and get my result back. And I'm going to get an actual result back response, and I can deal with everything that way. So they're starting to do that in the beta of Next.js 13. But you have to opt into it because it's a new feature, and they're still shaking it out. And there are still some places when I go to the documentation, I dig deeper, I'm like, oh, this hasn't been figured out yet. So probably in the next 3 to 6 months, that'll be more finalized. And if you're looking at it from 0 right now, I would look at that mechanism because the other one's going to be legacy soon. So the old page-spaced routing, the one that's you put files in pages, is going away, and the new one is app/app, and it goes there and has all these features. So server components are there. They work, and some of these other features. The other thing you can do is you can do things like promise.all and kick off a bunch of fetches. They run on the server side, server rendered, so you can have you don't have to just think of calling REST calls. If you've got your server running and you can get a connection to your database, you can call Postgres, right, or something like that. And you can do database calls from the server side, not have to go through a REST pipeline to get it back, and then send the results back to your component in server-side rendering. So you can certainly do that. The other thing that this one does, and it's the same with Remix and a couple of the other ones, is it exposes something called an API route. And that's just basically a path in your directory structure that does REST calls for you. So you can expose REST calls for the client side to call if you want to just do an arbitrary REST call that does something. So it gives you basically the equivalent of doing a node server of some sort for whatever APIs you want to expose. So that's available too. And not just with the beta. That's been available forever with Next.js. Remix Run is another interesting one. This one started out, I remember when it first started, they were working on a commercial product called Remix. And I guess they determined in the middle of doing the work, they might have just determined, we don't want to sell a commercial product. I mean, they felt the benefit of it was to open source it for everybody. So Remix Run is an alternate take on server-side rendering primarily. So it's relatively recent. I think it came out in 2021. We went to one of the first conferences, a couple of us, to the Remix Run conference and met the developers. And it's a smaller team for sure. But they really are focused. It's Michael Jackson, and I forget the other guy's name. But the focus of this is like, how fast can we make server-side rendering? And they consider static site generation a pre-optimization. They're like, look, if you're going to generate static content, then you got to deal with generating it all the time. Why don't you just cache the content in the CDN? So their perspective is, let the content delivery network cache things. There's your static content. And then just give it some directives to update these frequently and things like that. And we're going to focus on making this the fastest thing possible. And that's when you look at all their marketing and their blogs and stuff, they're really pushing, like, we are the fastest at eliminating any kind of pauses you can get during the static site, or the server-side rendering. And our goal is to, like, make less waterfalls for you, less fetch, wait, fetch, wait, fetch, wait, fetch, waits, by giving you as much parallelism as we can give you with server-side rendering. They also support these routes, these API routes, so you can build web services on them. And they also support progressive enhancement. That may be an old concept that you worked on a long time ago, maybe with jQuery frameworks and things like that, which was the concept of showing the form with someone who turned off JavaScript, which is very few people these days, I think, turn off JavaScript. But so you've got your browser with just the post, you click the button, and the form still works. Because you can write Remix forms in a way that they will progressively enhance the JavaScript, which is more like progressively degrade to not JavaScript realistically most of the time. And when JavaScript is turned off, they can handle all that work on the server side. So they're one of the frameworks that can do that, which makes them relatively unique. The other thing that makes them relatively unique is they don't buy in, like I said, to static site generation, but they also don't buy into React server components. So right now, there's an issue on GitHub, and I think I'm going to give you a resource at the end of this, so it's just a wiki page out of Notion you can look at with all these things compared. And if it's not on there, I'll put it on there right after the talk. But there's a really interesting Git issue that Dan Abramov put out there about Remix not supporting the suspense tag and the downsides of that, and trying to get Remix to support the way they suspend and resume content as they're loading things in the background. So that's the one area where I'm like, I want to see where they're going with that. Because I think whatever they do, they're probably going to end up changing something. They also have a new thing coming. They have 2.0. And so their way of opting into 2.0 features is a little different than the next team. In the next team, you turn on the new beta, and everything that's new is in the app folder. Right? That's their current new, cool new thing, feature, flip. They have a blog post called Future Flags. And Future Flags basically is they're feature flags for the future of the framework that you enable to turn on new features. And they're going to do this thing where they're going to enable the flag for a certain number of releases, and then it's going to become kind of like on by default, and then eventually the old way of doing something is going to go away. So they're trying to be a little more organized about how they release new features. You can already do this now by turning on some additional features they added to version 1. So for example, turning on CSS modules, hot module reload, and things like that. Those are probably already on, but Tailwind support, post-CSS support, you can flip on these flags in the configuration. If anyone's ever used Vanilla Extract as like a library that you can use in your CSS, you can have TypeScript and what have you to build up your CSS, another thing you'd enable with a flag, for example. But all the newer features are coming, and they're enabled when you opt into them by feature, so it doesn't break the framework for people that are going forward. So that's interesting. I find that as an interesting approach if you're going to work with this thing for a while. The thing you should know about them is they were bought by Shopify not that long ago. And I believe Hydrogen is Shopify's framework, if I remember correctly. So I think Drew and I were talking about this, but I think that they're helping on the Hydrogen framework too, probably. That's a guess. But We'll have to see what happens long-term to them because now they're part of an e-commerce company. So hopefully they stay Remix and Remix keeps going. So far, it doesn't look like they're hampering them in any way. They've been really actively working on version 2. So. Then there's Nuxt. Who are Vue developers in the room? Okay, we can move on. But online, I don't hear anything. But I'm going to assume that some of you raised your hands or pointed at me like you. So Nuxt is the Next.js-inspired framework, meta framework for Vue. And so you can imagine they've got server-side rendering and static site generation. They do have progressive enhancement, so that whole concept of like letting a form be submitted without HTML, they kind of pulled that from Remix. And clearly I have the same slide twice that I copy and pasted by. Hey, look at this, my slide's updated. Never mind the Remix slide and the run. So anyway, so if you look at this one, yes, there's a way of building that meta framework, to build out a Vue application and work with Vue and have the same kinds of concepts using Vue.js. They also have this engine called Nitro that they're using. Apparently, they're not the only ones using Nitro as a server-side engine. I guess it's kind of like more than Express that runs server-side requests for you. And they're girded based on that. And they're calling their server-side rendering universal rendering. So that's the term they use for it. They ship the HTML to the client, fully rendered, and then the browser reloads the JavaScript and hydrates the component, reloading any data that it needs. And then Vue takes over. Svelte, which is starting to gain some popularity out there, is another framework. What did I do? Oh my God, more. See, this is where, when you get no sleep, these things happen. Just-in-time development, folks. Anyway, so SvelteKit is the one for Svelte. And they do static-site rendering, server-side rendering as well. I'm going to update this slide. I think this slide is incorrect. But bottom line is there's one for Svelte as well, and it's called SvelteKit. Great. And yes, there's the one for Angular. It's called Analog. But I did notice it only has a couple hundred commits. So early days, there's a couple of YouTube videos where people are being interviewed about it, talking about it. But I get the sense that if you're doing Angular, you might someday use this. But then again, I felt the same thing about NX and all those things, the Narwhal stuff. And I'm not sure many people use the Narwhal framework. They probably do, but I just haven't run into it. So it's very Angular-y. So server-side rendering and static site generation with some caveats. So what I started doing, just to kind of jump to it, let me show you what I have. And I'm going to share this as a wiki in Notion for you. I already have the link. I started just going through all of these and doing comparisons and linking all the features together to get my head around all these features. And just a few of these things started to emerge. Like, for example, most of the frameworks support server-side rendering. I would say on Gatsby, the proviso is it's not supported on everything, right? You have to use their cloud service, I believe. But most everything else supports server-side rendering these days. Static site generation, Remix is the one that's the holdout there. Incremental static generation, Gatsby really does this with deferred site generation, stack generation. And I'm missing Remix on that. So I'm missing Next.js on that. So Next.js does support it, and they support incremental. And then Remix does not support static site generation. Okay, so started to kind of compare these, but they each have kind of their own sweet spot, right? So if you're into the maximum support for server rendered or generated React, in my opinion, right now, I think it's really Next.js. If you're into where things might be heading, and you want to see where the innovators are, you can look at the Remix team. They are doing interesting things. I would be a little concerned about picking that as a framework until I know how some of these newer features shake out. especially if we wanted to look into React server components. But there are people using Remix, and they love it. And Gatsby, again, if you're a big static site person. If you've got a lot of content to generate for marketing sites, it certainly makes sense. Another feature that a lot of these have is prefetching. And the idea being you go to your first route, and now you've got other places to go, your menuing system or what have you. How aggressively should we start preloading these links? So, just taking an example of like Next.js, in the link tag they provide, so they provide their own link tag in the Next library that wraps their routing and their navigation. So when I go to a link, I can say, go ahead and prefetch this thing. Maybe prefetch it immediately when I load the page. If it's static content, then I don't have to worry about running queries against and hitting the database. Maybe that makes sense. If I start hovering over it, start to prefetch. Or don't prefetch at all. So those are the three options, for example, in Next.js. Remix Run has similar features as well. You can say, as I'm hovering over a link, go ahead and prefetch it. So by the time I click that link, the page is populated and I get a nice quick hit. So if you're looking for fast page-to-page navigation, you want to make sure that you look at the prefetching features on those frameworks. And generally, prefetching is their linking tag with some attributes. It's generally how it works. In Svelte, it's an ahref with some properties that enable it. It's a similar kind of concept. And all of them basically support this. Gatsby has Gatsby link. There's a Nuxt link component. There's a Remix Run link component, and so on. But of course, they can't have a standard. It's not HTML. It's their thing, right? So, if you're going to work with Next.js and you port to Remix, you'll have to look at those and reevaluate how you implement your links, of course. Things like optimizing fonts. So which ones inline fonts by default? Or have an option inline fonts. So Analog didn't look like they had a lot of these features yet because it was relatively new. But Gatsby, for example, there's a plugin to inline your fonts. There's a plugin to load some scripts asynchronously. That's one of the things I noticed too. Having some scripts load that aren't part of your app that have to load, but you want to hold up the front end from loading. Like, you got your Google Analytics. You need it there, but you don't want to hold up the page render for that. So go ahead and asynchronously drop a script tag and load it once the page is started. So Next.js has a script tag for that. It's a capital script tag instead of lowercase script. You import it, you use it as a component. And a bunch of the other ones have this feature as well. In Nuxt, it's a header property that you can adjust and add scripts to. Didn't see it in Remix, didn't see it in Svelte, but Gatsby and Next have that. Gatsby and Next have image processing, Gatsby through the pipelining. Next has an image tag. I wrestled a bit with the image tag. It's a little finicky, but it can cache images for you on the server once they're fetched. The other option is to do static site generation for things that have content with images, and it will build the images out into the final target that you can then serve if they're part of the content it can download. So you have a couple ways of dealing with that if you're on Next. And then fetching. Again, I was mentioning this universal fetch concept of having fetch both the fetch function both in the browser and on the server side. So right now, Next.js, Remix, and SvelteKit are all trying to do this with the fetch API, request response, URL. All right. So again, do you really need to do it? I just put this in there just for humor content, if there's any humor in it at all. Let's use it for everything. Don't use it for everything. Use it if it makes sense. Don't just go to server-side rendering if you're going to put it on a really, really anemic single Docker instance and assume it's going to scale. If it's a node server, you get one active thread on the node server at a time. It's not going to scale that way. So you have to think about that. If you think you're going to do it and boot it serverlessly, there's even a note, I believe it's the Remix site said, it's either Next.js or the Remix site, said you can do serverless, whatever the framework is that I can't remember at the moment. But remember that it takes 100 to 300 milliseconds to boot the serverless container to serve the content. And maybe that's okay for the site. Maybe you have an internal site, and you just need to boot up when they're using it, and it can die later and save you money. Maybe it's good enough. Just know that before you start using it for something that the public's going to hit, and they're going to really try to ramp up the network request against. All right, so there it is. Meta frameworks, all the things. What can go wrong? Right, and again, do you need it? I don't know. Maybe you do. One of the things that'll hurt you here is, this is that whole thing. Who has done a back-end for front-end pattern for applications? That pattern is you hit a server that you write with all the REST calls, then goes and hits everything else for you. Back-end for front-end, right? Some of those are written in Java, so you can't server render that. You can server render a request to it, but what are you really gaining? You're now having 2 requests in to get to the thing you already wrote the thing to give you an answer for. So you may not really be able to use some of these things depending on what they are based on your existing architecture, but it's another thing you can try. Do you need to share code between client and server? If your server is Java, how much can you share between the client and the server? But if you're currently writing Node backends for your front ends, and you've got this boundary that's arbitrary and difficult to deal with because you had to write an Express app, and that's one repo, and you had to create an Angular or whatever React app, and that's another repo, a mono repo with one of these frameworks could really help kind of tie it all together. And is your code fast enough? If no one's complaining about your app and it's got decent page speed, great. Do you need to go down this road? Sometimes we look at something and say, you don't need this one thing you think you need, because what you're about to walk into is so complex that you're going to be hanging that as an albatross around your neck the rest of the project. Sometimes that's the case. So just be aware, really evaluate these carefully. Right? What are your scores? How's it going? Another interesting thing, so this is the link to the, good thing I have a slide for it. There's a link to issue 5763. That's the one with Dan Abramoff going back and forth with the team at Remix to try to solve the problem of not properly using the React 18 suspense hooks so that they can't really get to the point where they do React server components. It's an interesting read. We'll see where it is. It's an open issue right now. Another issue that you run into, especially when you deal with component frameworks and server-side rendering, is hydration errors. So if you're experimenting with Remix or Remix or Next.js, you'll probably run into this. You have some sort of placeholder that DOM looks completely different than what the response is that comes back. And you'll get the client didn't match the content of the server response. At first you're like, what is this? And it's because the shape of it has to conform in order for it to update that content inside. So if you put the right placeholders in the right place and you shape it the right way, you'll be fine. But if you just have some arbitrary, hey, I'm loading, and then you get a response that's completely different, it might blow up on you. So there's some discussions out there about how to handle that for each of the frameworks. So a couple things, you can keep the same DOM structure. So like the initial render from the server side and use effect should bring back the same shape. If you're in a React world, Vue would have the same kind of thing to deal with their loading event. Ensure that your fetch data doesn't invalidate the DOM. That's another weird one. Like somehow you've got a client-side API that suddenly puts a div in a paragraph. It's going to blow up anyway, but it might not blow up until you hit the server. So, and then go back and hit the client, I should say. So wait, it'll happen. Make sure your CSS styles are the same, because if it can't find the styling and it looks different, it's going to freak out. So whatever you generate on the way down should match any kind of styling you add on the way back. And I believe it was Remix. I can't remember. One of them had some additional config to add to make sure like CSS and JS frameworks played nice with this too. All right, I think we beat this up enough. So yeah, do a lot of research, see what makes sense. Do they make sense for you? I'm not sure. If you're heavy content management, look at Gatsby. If you're heavy on server-side rendering, look at, and again, I'm talking React here. If you're heavy on server-side rendering, you want to look at Next.js and maybe Remix. If you're using Svelte, you have a choice. It's called SvelteKit. If you're using Vue, you probably have a choice called Nuxt. And so the biggest question I think I have to ask when I'm looking at this is, how long is this thing going to exist? And how stable is the framework I'm about to adopt? I know that everything in the website moves way too quick. Like, we're talking about Vite. We were only talking about Vite for a year and a half now, and it's like taken over. We're talking about monorepos for about 2 or 3 years. It's taken over. Next.js is actually one of the older ones, 2016. Gatsby, 2015. They've been around a while. So Remix is relatively new. What do you want to do about using it? If you're doing a pilot or an internal app that's going to live for a certain amount of time, maybe it's a good thing you can take on and see where it goes. But if you're building an entire e-commerce site for 10 years based on something, you really want to make sure the company is stable. So those are the other questions I usually ask myself too. I have, and we'll publish the slides, but I have this, it's a tiny URL meta framework matrix. And I'll be updating this over time because I'm still doing research on this. But it's a wiki that I did in Notion that has, I think I showed you briefly, has all the different frameworks I'm looking at the top and all the features I was looking at. And anywhere I found a feature that comported with it, I linked it into the yes. A couple of ones at the top, I still have to put the links in. But hopefully that's useful for you. So go ahead and take a picture of that. I'll leave that up. Thanks, everybody.